Atlanta's African-American community lived in terror for 2 years. Children couldn't play outside alone. Parents formed escort groups to walk kids to school. Curfews were imposed across the city. Between July 1979 and May 1981, 29 children and young adults were murdered in what became known as the Atlanta child murders. The killings created a climate of fear that changed the city forever. When Wayne Williams was arrested, the community wanted to believe the nightmare was over. But doubts about his guilt have persisted for 43 years, leaving families to wonder if their children's real killer was never brought to justice. If you're fascinated by cases where entire communities fought back against terror, make sure to subscribe because this story reveals how ordinary people protected their children when the system seemed to fail them. Camille Bell thought she was raising her son in the safest neighborhood she could afford. Mechanicsville wasn't wealthy, but it was stable. Working families, decent schools, the kind of place where children could walk to the corner store without their parents worrying. That sense of security shattered on July 28, 1979. Her 9-year-old son Yusef disappeared while running an errand to the store. Camille waited through the night, calling friends, checking with neighbors, hoping he'd fallen asleep at someone's house. 2 days later, searchers found Yusef's body in a wooded area on the south side of Atlanta. The police treated it as an isolated incident. One child, one tragedy, probably someone known to the family. They asked Camille about her ex-husband, about men she dated, about anyone who might have targeted her son specifically. But this wasn't about Camille or her family. Someone was hunting children in Atlanta. 3 weeks after Yusef's murder, 13-year-old Angel Lanier was found tied to a tree and sexually assaulted. A month later, 7-year-old LaTanya Wilson vanished from her apartment complex playground. Then Milton Harvey, Yusef's friend from a neighborhood, disappeared on his way to the bank. By September 1979, 4 African-American children were dead, and the pattern was undeniable. Someone was deliberately targeting kids in Atlanta's black communities. Camille Bell became the voice of terrified parents across the city. She demanded police attention, organized community meetings, and confronted city officials who seemed more concerned about Atlanta's image than protecting children. "Our babies are dying," she told a packed church meeting in October 1979, and we're the only ones who seem to care. The predominantly white police department struggled to connect with grieving families. Officers asked insensitive questions, dismissed community concerns, and treated each murder as an isolated incident rather than part of a growing crisis. Parents began organizing their own protection networks. They created buddy systems for children walking to school. They established safe houses where kids could stop if they felt threatened. They formed volunteer patrols to monitor playgrounds and bus stops. But the killings continued. By early 1980, Atlanta's African-American community had fundamentally changed how children lived their daily lives. Gone were the days when kids could roam neighborhoods freely, visit friends unannounced, or walk to the store alone. Venus Taylor organized one of the first parent escort groups in her southwest Atlanta neighborhood. Every morning, teams of mothers and fathers walked children to school in groups. Every afternoon, they reversed the process, ensuring no child traveled alone. "We became a convoy," Venus remembered years later. 20, 30 kids with 4 or 5 adults. "We looked like we were marching to war because that's what it felt like." The escort system required extraordinary coordination. Parents took time off work, rearranged schedules, and shared responsibilities with neighbors they'd barely spoken to before the murders began. The crisis forced communities to come together in ways Atlanta hadn't seen since the Civil Rights Movement. Local churches became coordination centers for safety efforts. Pastors shared information about suspicious activities, organized prayer vigils for murdered children, and provided meeting spaces for parents to plan protection strategies. Betty Williams, whose son Jeffrey would later become a victim, helped establish a neighborhood watch program that operated 24 hours a day. Volunteers took shifts, monitoring streets from front porches and windows, reporting anything unusual to police. "We couldn't trust that somebody else was going to protect our children," Betty explained. "So we had to protect them ourselves." The psychological toll on families was devastating. Children who had once played outside until dark were now required to stay within sight of their homes. Many developed anxiety about leaving familiar areas, even with adult supervision. Parents struggled with impossible decisions. How much freedom could they give their children without putting them at risk? How do you explain to a 7-year-old that someone might want to hurt them without destroying their innocence entirely? Some families considered leaving Atlanta altogether, but most couldn't afford to relocate, and many felt a responsibility to stay and fight for their community's safety. If you're finding this story as powerful as the families who lived through it, don't forget to subscribe for more cases where communities refuse to let fear win. The murders also revealed deep divides within Atlanta society. Wealthy white neighborhoods experienced no similar attacks, leading many African-American families to question whether police would respond differently if the victims looked like their own children. Media coverage initially focused on individual tragedies rather than recognizing a pattern. Local newspapers treated each murder as a separate story, failing to connect the dots that parents and community leaders saw clearly. Camille Bell and other activist mothers began holding weekly press conferences demanding consistent coverage and police accountability. They created their own communication networks, sharing information faster than official channels could process it. By summer 1980, the community-led safety measures had become so comprehensive that they resembled a wartime mobilization. Parents coordinated through informal networks, children moved in protected groups, and entire neighborhoods operated under unofficial martial law. The killers seemed to adapt to these new security measures. Victims began disappearing from increasingly public places, suggesting someone who understood community protection patterns and found ways to circumvent them. On May 22, 1981, police surveillance teams monitoring the Chattahoochee River heard a splash from the James Jackson Parkway Bridge. When they stopped the first car leaving the area, they found Wayne Williams, a 23-year-old African-American man who lived with his parents in northwest Atlanta. Williams claimed he was scouting locations for a music talent search. Police found his explanation suspicious, especially when the body of Nathaniel Cater was discovered in the river 2 days later. The arrest brought mixed reactions from Atlanta's black community. Relief that someone had been caught, but confusion about whether Williams fit the profile of the person who had terrorized their children. Williams was young, black, and from the same community as his alleged victims. This contradicted FBI profiles, suggesting the killer would be white and older. Some community members struggled to believe that someone from their own neighborhood could have committed such crimes. Camille Bell remained skeptical about Williams' guilt. She had studied every aspect of the cases, analyzing patterns and evidence that connected her son's murder to the others. Williams' arrest felt too convenient, too neat for such a complex investigation. "I know what killed my child," she said at a community meeting after Williams' conviction, "and I'm not convinced we caught him." The trial focused on 2 adult victims, Nathan Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne. Williams was convicted based primarily on fiber evidence, microscopic materials allegedly linking him to both crimes. He received 2 life sentences, effectively ending the active investigation. But Williams was never tried for the children's murders. Police simply declared those cases closed, citing similar fiber evidence and the fact that killings stopped after his arrest. This decision troubled many families who felt their children's cases deserved individual attention and resolution. They had endured 2 years of terror, organized their entire lives around protecting their kids, only to be told the nightmare was over without definitive proof. Venus Taylor continued coordinating escort groups for months after Williams' arrest. Trust didn't return immediately to communities that had lived under siege. Parents needed time to believe their children were truly safe. "We've been scared for so long," Venus remembered. "One arrest wasn't going to make us stop protecting our babies overnight." The community mobilization efforts outlasted the immediate crisis. Many of the safety networks established during the murders became permanent features of neighborhood life. Parents maintained communication systems. Churches continued hosting community meetings, and children learned safety awareness that would benefit them throughout their lives. But questions about the case persisted. Fiber evidence that convicted Williams was later challenged by forensic experts who argued that the microscopic analysis was less definitive than prosecutors claimed. Some victims' families never believed Williams was responsible for their children's deaths. Willie Mae Mathis, whose son Jeffrey was found murdered in February 1981, spent decades advocating for case reviews. She believed the real killer remained free while communities celebrated a false resolution. They wanted to close the books, she said years later. But some of us never stopped asking questions. Modern forensic techniques, unavailable in 1982, could potentially resolve doubts about Williams' guilt or innocence. But Georgia authorities have resisted comprehensive testing, citing the age of evidence and Williams' existing conviction. The Atlanta child murders changed how law enforcement approaches serial crime investigations. The FBI developed new behavioral analysis techniques, established victim databases, and created protocols for multi-jurisdictional cooperation that are still used today. But the case's most lasting impact may be how it transformed community-based child protection. The safety networks created by Atlanta's African-American families became models for neighborhood watch programs, school security measures, and parent coordination systems across the country. Camille Bell continued advocating for families of murder victims until her death in 2019. She never stopped believing that important questions about her son's case remained unanswered, and that communities needed to stay vigilant regardless of official reassurances. The escort groups, neighborhood watches, and communication networks developed during Atlanta's 2 years of terror proved that ordinary people could organize extraordinary protection for their children. These parents didn't wait for government solutions. They created their own. Today, Mechanicsville and other Atlanta neighborhoods where the murders occurred look very different. Gentrification has changed demographics. New residents have arrived, and many of the families who lived through the crisis have moved away. But the lessons learned during those terrifying years remain relevant. Parents still organize carpools and walking groups. Communities still coordinate through informal networks. And families still understand that protecting children requires collective effort rather than individual vigilance alone. The Atlanta child murders represented both a community's darkest period and its finest response to crisis. Faced with systematic terror, ordinary people created extraordinary protection systems that saved countless lives. Whether Wayne Williams was guilty of the crimes that convicted him remains debated. But there's no question that Atlanta's African-American community displayed remarkable courage and organization during 2 years when their children's lives were at stake. If you're inspired by stories where communities fought back against impossible odds, make sure you're subscribed for more cases where ordinary people achieved extraordinary things in the face of terror. The children who died between 1979 and 1981 are remembered not just as victims, but as the reason an entire community learned to protect itself. Their legacy lives on in every parent who walks their child to school, every neighborhood that organizes safety patrols, and every community that refuses to let fear divide them. Atlanta's response to the child murders proved that when institutions fail, people can create their own solutions. The escort groups, communication networks, and protection systems developed during the crisis became permanent improvements to community safety, ensuring that future generations would benefit from hard-won lessons about collective security.